Hi, everyone. My name is Sonia Costa, and I'm a policy analyst at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's virtual kickoff for our Day of Action to Keep Families Together. With your help, we've already seen some great successes to oppose this rule from HUD, and we look forward to your continued partnership. We'll start today with a short introduction on the issue from National Low-Income Housing Coalition's President and CEO, Diane Yentl, who will then hand it over to our special guest, Representative Sylvia Garcia of Texas. After hearing from the Congresswoman, who actually is not able to make it today, but from her representative, we'll provide additional information on the proposed rule, its impacts. We'll discuss owners' opposition to the proposal and share how you can get involved and take action. So I'm going to turn it over to Diane Yentl.
Great, thanks, Sonia, and thanks everybody for joining today's webinar to talk about how to protect immigrant families in subsidized housing. And even more, thanks for all your attention and work on this issue to oppose HUD's rule. We've been really heartened to see just how many, and not surprised, but heartened for sure, to see just how many of our partners and members and allies across the country have been joining us in opposing this rule. I think we're a really powerful group together, and I do think that if we keep it up, we can defeat this harmful proposal. So just to back up for a moment, as many of you know, HUD has put forward this rule that's known as the mixed status immigrant proposed rule. And to be clear, what HUD is proposing to do with this rule is to evict families who have undocumented or otherwise ineligible immigrants and their families in their homes from public and other subsidized housing. So with this rule, 25,000 families with over 100,000 people are at risk of eviction and potentially homelessness, and included in those numbers are 55,000 children that are U.S. citizens or have legal status. And also, to be clear, federal housing subsidies do not support undocumented immigrants. It's clearly not permitted by law, in regulations, and it doesn't happen in practice. What is permitted is what's called mixed status households. So these are households where undocumented immigrants or otherwise ineligible immigrants that are part of a family are permitted to live in the unit, and the rents are carefully prorated to ensure that none of the subsidy assists the undocumented immigrants portion of the rent. And there's multiple ways that PHAs can calculate the rent that's charged to those households to ensure that the subsidies don't benefit the undocumented members of the household. But in all cases, these mixed status families pay at least 10% higher rents, and many of them pay much higher than that, close to market rate rents in some communities. These rules have been in place and have been carefully followed for over 30 years. And now HUD is proposing this rule that would prevent these mixed status families from living together. So in practice, it would mean that the families would have to choose either to split up with the undocumented immigrants in the household facing potential homelessness, or in most cases, the entire family could be evicted and face homelessness. And clearly at a time like now, when the housing crisis is worsening by the day, it is truly appalling to have the HUD secretary using his authority and his resources to propose increasing homelessness and to increase it among some of our country's most vulnerable people. So a few really important things to know about this rule, which you probably already know if you're on this webinar, but one is that at this point it is just a proposal. So the first thing we need everybody to do is to register your opposition to the rule through submitting comments, and then get at least one other person or one other organization to do the same. So as of today, there's over 8,000 comments that have been submitted, and I've scrolled through most of them, and I would say it's 500 to 1, maybe even 600 to 1 in strong opposition. I usually try to avoid comments, reading comments on media stories or others around issues like this, but in this case, I'd say if you're feeling badly about humanity or issues, you take a look at these comments because they are powerful and passionately opposed to this rule, just as all of us are. So 8,000 comments is amazing. We want many, many more. Every additional comment delays this rule from potentially going into effect. And so that's why today we've encouraged organizations throughout the country to participate in a day of action to keep families together. We know of partners and events in Illinois, California, Minnesota, New Jersey, Michigan, New Mexico, and beyond that are holding comment parties today, gathering members and partners and members of the community together to write comments to oppose the rule. Here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we're having a comment party at our office at 4:30. So if you're in the DC area, please come by. And so the first part of our strategy to defeat this rule is to flood HUD with comments opposing the rule. And the second is a legislative strategy. And for both of those, we're really pleased to have Representative Garcia as an ally and a leader working also to oppose this rule. So Representative Garcia was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in November 2018, becoming the first Latina ever to represent Texas's 29th congressional district. She's dedicated her life to her community and to public service. She was a social worker and a legal aid lawyer early in her career, working to protect the community's most vulnerable people. She continued her public service career by serving in the Houston municipal system as city controller and as the first Hispanic and first woman to be elected to Harris County Commission's Court and in the Texas State Senate. So in 2018, she decided to take her fight to Washington, and we're so glad that she did, because as a member of the powerful House Financial Services Committee, she's using her voice and her power, just as she has throughout her career, to protect the most vulnerable people. She's led the fight in the committee and in the U.S. House of Representatives to keep families together. She's introduced legislation to prevent HUD from moving forward with this proposal, and we're really pleased to let everybody know that her legislation passed favorably out of committee earlier this month. So unfortunately, we just got word about 5 minutes ago that Congresswoman Garcia is not available to be on the webinar because she's doing a little thing like being on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives voting on bills. So given that that's her job, of course, we're disappointed that she herself is not able to join us, but her legislative director is, and I'll introduce him in just a moment, but I'm so glad to have Congresswoman Garcia's participation in her office's participation in this webinar. One, because it gives us the opportunity to publicly thank her and her staff for their tremendous work on this issue to really stand up and lead the fight against this proposal. And also to hear more from her office about their efforts and their plans and how we can continue to work together to stop this proposal in the tracks. So again, Congresswoman Garcia is on the floor voting right now, and so instead we have Pat Bond, who is Congresswoman Garcia's legislative director, on the line. And Pat, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you for all the work that the National Low Income Housing Coalition has done in supporting us as Congresswoman Garcia has fought this proposal. First off, let me extend the Congresswoman's apologies for not being able to participate today directly. She was very much looking forward to it, and unfortunately votes prevented that from happening. But let me pass on her thanks to everybody who is participating in this webinar today. If you're participating, then you know how heartless and senseless this proposal from HUD truly is for thousands of American families across this country. The cruelty of the proposed HUD rule is truly remarkable, even by the standards of this administration. Secretary Carson has chosen politics over people here, and some of the statistics are just remarkable. This rule, if enacted, could end up forcing 55,000 American children to be separated from their families or risk homelessness. And HUD's proposal will significantly harm already impoverished children and pass on significant costs to the taxpayers. Specifically, by getting rid of mixed status families, $227 million new dollars would have to be provided for families to cover all whose households include eligible members. To pay for the higher costs, HUD would be forced to reduce the quality and quantity of assisted housing, and their own analysis backs this up as the most likely scenario. And that $227 million cost doesn't include the cost of evictions of $4.5 million, whose administrative burden would fall to the housing authorities, and it doesn't include moving costs of up to $13 million on the families involved. Simply put, HUD is seeking to spend more to help fewer people, and it doesn't make sense, and it's incredibly maddening. Beating back this rule will require fighting hard with all the tools that we have available. The Congresswoman introduced the Keep Families Together Act to block this rule, and the House Financial Services Committee passed that legislation. Senator Gillibrand has introduced the Senate companion to that legislation in the Senate, and a provision based on the Keep Families Together Act was included in the annual HUD appropriations bill. But Congress alone isn't going to stop this. We need groups like yours to file comments and to push back with the public as well, so that HUD knows there's real opposition to this proposal, and to hear that voice. Secretary Carson testified in front of the Financial Services Committee, and it is clear that they are not focused on the real world individual impact that this proposal would have on families, and so it's important for that to be made front and center. And beyond the comments, I know that if it comes to it, this issue will be litigated as well. So on behalf of the Congresswoman, I'd like to thank you all for your work and commitment to ensuring that families are kept together. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sonia.
Thank you so much, Pat, and please extend our gratitude to the Congresswoman for all that she has been doing, and thanks to you for taking the time and for all your office's leadership on this issue in Congress. I'd now like to introduce Noel Porter. Oh, thanks, Pat. I'd like to introduce Noel Porter, who is the Director of Government Affairs for the National Housing Law Project, and she's going to provide some additional context and information about the rule. So Noel, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sonia. I wanted to just say thanks to Diane for setting out kind of a good framework for what we're all doing here and the process of opposing such an egregious rule. I think she laid a great foundation for helping us to understand just how harmful and how widespread the effects of this proposed rule would be. And taking a step back, I'm going to try to give a brief overview of sort of where current regulation and law stands and what the administration is attempting to do. And our goal is that you who are attending this call, you who have probably been with us since the beginning in this campaign, will be very well versed in talking about this issue, in spreading the need for comment, in making your own comments, and in becoming a part of the fight against this egregious rule, as those who have spoken before me have said. So currently, federal regulations and statute do, as Diane say, establish a foundation for mixed status opportunities for families. What happens is when you apply for federal assistance, federally assisted housing, you simply check a box certifying that under penalty of law, you are either eligible or ineligible for these federally assisted programs. You don't have to indicate at that time whether that has any bearing on your documentation status or the type of visa holder you may be, and you don't have to go through any type of screening procedure. Then, based on your eligibility, once you do receive a voucher or a public housing unit, your family is then given, as Diane said, a prorated subsidy. So an easy example would be in a family of 5, if mom and grandma are undocumented or a visa holder of some type and the children are U.S. citizen children, then you would receive a 60% subsidy. And so we'll continue operating under that example. what the proposed rule is attempting to do is two things. One, it is saying that it's no longer going to be acceptable to simply check a box indicating that you are eligible or ineligible, but that you would now need to be screened through a system called SAVE, and that screening process would send your information to the Department of Homeland Security. So immediately off the bat, there's a red flag there for whether or not we're using the federal government to send documentation status of individuals to DHS and what the implications are there and the chilling effect on the communities and the immigrant communities living in public housing or federally assisted housing. What they're talking about is to screen all of the over 9 million citizens and tenants in HUD's federally assisted programs and those that are on the wait list. So the implications of that are incredibly burdensome and costly. We will hear from our partner, Emily Warren, later, who will talk about some of the industry and Public Housing Authority opposition to this because of simply the burden and impact on the work that they're doing at the ground level. It also is extremely disconcerting when we think about the civil rights implications of documentation and requiring people who are low income, who may have been born in rural communities or maybe not in hospitals, to find all of the documentation necessary, and it may have a large impact on U.S. citizens living in federally assisted housing as well. So we would begin with a rescreening of every individual engaged in the federally assisted housing programs, and then what would happen is one of three things. Those families that are identified as mixed status through that screening process would either have to choose to try to find a way to find full fair market rent, which let's assume that family of 5, the 2 mom and grandma, have this subsidized housing because they have gone through all of the eligibility and screening procedures with the PHA in their community and been identified as having a low-income need for this assistance. And we can assume that they have not made up the difference, in their income in the less than 2 years since their screening. The second option would be to kick out those ineligible members of the family from the subsidized housing. There may be instances where we're talking about, say, a mom and a dad, or a mom and a cousin, or a mom and a grandma, where one of those adult members is eligible for the assistance and they could leave the other eligible adult behind with the children. But oftentimes I believe we're talking about families where the ineligible tenants are adults and the eligible tenants are those 55,000 children that Diane and Pat mentioned previously. And kicking out the eligible responsible adults who are caring for the children, or the ineligible, responsible adults, is simply impossible. And so what we believe is the largest consequence we'll be facing, based on the data we've seen, is that we will have families facing eviction and homelessness. And as Pat said, the burden on our federal systems in other ways and the burden on the taxpayers is significant. And finally, what this does, and so those are the two parts of the rule, is to screen everyone, and then when we identify families of mixed status in the new screening procedure, to make them either face eviction or split up. As I said, the administrative costs and the burden of this are significant. We'll talk a little bit more about that later with Emily. But also, as Pat said, what we'll have to do is replace those families who receive, in our example, say 60% of their prorated subsidy, with families who are 100% eligible. They're not of mixed status, and they will have to receive a 100% subsidy. And therefore, if we are to kick out 25,000 families based on the evidence in the government's analysis, we won't be able to replace them with 25,000 families or 25,000 vouchers or 25,000 units. We'll be losing federal assistance in the process. A couple things I just want to highlight too in the talking points about this. So we've sort of explained the groundwork and how the rule works. A couple more things that I think are really important. We talk a lot about this administration's attack on undocumented immigrants, and it's egregious and it's aggressive. But it's also really important to understand that this rule also targets a number of ineligible legal immigrants who are unable to access public housing or Section 8. This includes student visa holders, employment visa holders, U visa holders who may be victims of violence, recipients from DACA, and even temporary protected status residents. So we've granted them all of these legal ways to access our country. They simply may not be making enough income to live safely, and now we're going to take away their ability to live safely in the country, even though we've allowed them to come here legally. So I think it's really important that as we have this conversation, we talk about the impact on legal residents who are not necessarily legal citizens. And the other thing that I really want to note is that I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, that the talking point of the administration has been, we're trying to do our part to pull down folks off of our extensive waiting list, the millions of people who are waiting for federally assisted housing across the country. We want to do our part to chip away at that waiting list. However, this administration consistently has asked for 20% cuts to our federally assisted housing programs in the president's budget request to Congress every year. And we know that that would have a significant impact on increasing our waiting list, cutting our federal housing assistance, and leaving families homeless and out in the cold. And so this idea of taking these 25,000 mixed status families off the list and replacing them with even fewer 100% subsidies would amount to taking 0.5% of the families on the waiting list across the country off of that waiting list. And so we really want to fight back on the idea that the administration is saying we're simply concerned about the wait list. So with that, I'll turn it back to Sonia, but we'll stick around for questions that you guys might have at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Noel, for that additional context around the rule. I'm going to turn it over now to Emily Warren, who is a Senior Research and Policy Analyst at the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities, to discuss how PHAs and others are responding to this proposal. Emily?
Thanks, Sonia. So first, just a little bit about CLAFA. The Council of Large Public Housing Authorities is a membership organization consisting of 70 of the nation's largest PHAs. And together, our members manage nearly 40% of all public housing stock and administer more than a quarter of Housing Choice Program vouchers. We work to support our member PHAs in their mission of providing safe and affordable housing to low-income residents, and we share their vision that stable housing is a platform for improving life outcomes and a foundation for healthy communities. And as large PHAs, our members serve a significant proportion of the mixed status families who would be affected by this proposed rule. And our members are deeply concerned about the rule's impacts on residents, PHAs, private landlords, and communities. So today I'll briefly outline concerns from the PHA perspective regarding impacts on these four groups. First, as others have discussed, the proposed rule would have significant impacts on residents. In addition to HUD's estimated 25,000 mixed status households who would see their assistance terminated, other households with all eligible household members who did not produce a birth certificate when their housing assistance began would be required to produce those documents at their next recertification. Eligible household members may not have produced a birth certificate for several reasons, such as if they relied on an alternative form of identification to prove identity and citizenship, or if they're a child who was born after the family began receiving housing assistance. So therefore, we're also concerned about the potential termination of assistance for an unknown number of households with eligible status who will be held to strict new documentation requirements in order to maintain their housing assistance. In addition to impacts on residents, we're concerned about impacts for PHAs, particularly the additional burdens that this rule would impose through eviction, turnover, and administrative costs. In its own analysis, HUD estimates eviction costs associated with the rule at $4.4 million. We consider this to be a low estimate based on their unsupported assumptions of how many formal evictions will be required and the cost to PHAs per eviction. Further, PHAs will incur significant costs associated with turning over a unit to prepare for new residents, which can cost up to $10,000 per unit. HUD also estimates that the rule will require, quote, minimal administrative hours, which our members consider to be highly inaccurate. PHAs will be required to develop policies and procedures for the new status verification process, in addition to developing processes for households eligible for exemptions or waivers. The PHA will be expected to incur all of these additional costs without any additional funding to cover them. For PHAs with even a small number of mixed status families, this represents a significant financial burden. The staff hours required to complete this work will result in less staff time available for other tasks critical to PHA operations at a time when PHA administrative work is already underfunded. A third group impacted by this proposed rule is private landlords. The proposed rule would result in terminated assistance for mixed status families in public housing as well as those renting from private landlords through the Housing Choice Voucher program. PHAs currently face many challenges in finding landlords to participate in the voucher program. The proposed rule would intensify these challenges by requiring participating landlords renting to mixed status families to evict them, meaning that landlords will need to go through the eviction process, turn over the unit, secure a new voucher tenant, and complete the paperwork and processes required to rent to a new tenant being subsidized by the voucher program. We heard landlord perspectives during the recent federal government shutdown, that the shutdown was affecting the voucher program's reputation as a program with consistent funding, and the proposed rule also threatens the program's reputation as one with a consistent policy. Finally, our members are concerned about the rule's impacts on their communities. In December 2018, CLAFA submitted comments expressing its opposition to the proposed public charge rule, which would change the definition of a public charge to include receipt of federal housing assistance. This year, the Urban Institute reported that according to a December 2018 survey, 1 in 7 adults reported a chilling effect, and that the survey respondent or a family member did not participate in a non-cash assistance program out of fear of risking lawful permanent resident status in the future. Similarly, our members are concerned that mixed status households, as well as households with all eligible members, will avoid seeking housing assistance out of concern that it will affect their future immigration status. This fear has been borne out from stories we've heard from our members who worry that this proposed rule will exacerbate those fears within immigrant communities. Our members feel strongly that a reinterpreted regulation intended to scare families away from using critical safety net programs is not sound public policy, and our comments on the proposed rule will reflect this position. And I'll turn it back over to Sonia.
Thank you so much, Emily. So now you've heard a bunch of different reasons to oppose this rule, so I'm going to discuss how you can actually oppose it and what actions you can take. So our primary ask right now is for both individuals and organizations to submit comments expressing their opposition. Comments are most valuable to us when they contain at least 30% original content, since HUD is required to review and respond to each unique comment submitted. We're hoping to generate as many comments as possible. Like Diane mentioned, this can help slow down the implementation of the rule, and it gives us more time to work on the legislative strategy and our litigation strategy. As part of today's Day of Action, we have been asking folks to host comment parties, and Diane mentioned some places where we know that those are taking place. And even if they are just internal within your office, you could still manage to pull something together today if you hadn't already planned to do so. If you are going to do something for today's Day of Action, please post photos and use the hashtag #KeepFamiliesTogether. We're keeping track and we'll repost, retweet, and all of that. Even if you weren't able to plan for something for today, you still have the opportunity to engage your community in this way before the deadline, which is July 9th. So we have a campaign website, which is www.keepfamiliestogether.org. There's dashes in between there. We'll put it up in just a minute. We have a bunch of resources up there, including a comment party toolkit and resources to help you draft and submit comments, including a multi-sector comment template and state-level data. The site also has a portal where you can submit comments written in both English and Spanish. All comments do need to be submitted in English, so we have several partner organizations that have volunteered to translate submissions in Spanish. We also really need your help with outreach. Once you've commented, okay, get another organization to submit their comments as well. Our website has a social media kit. We have talking points, a page with relevant news stories that we keep updated. Should make it all easy for you to encourage your network to submit comments. You can also reach out to your members of Congress and ask them to submit comments or send a letter of opposition. We have a page on our website that is tracking who in Congress has already expressed their opposition. So we've been gaining a lot of momentum already. Representative Garcia's bill passed through House Financial Services Committee. Yesterday, the House passed the Transportation and HUD funding bill that included language to slow down HUD's implementation of the rule. And like Diane mentioned, we have more than 8,500 comments already submitted. That is more than any other HUD rule, we think. Anyway, that's what we've been told, is it's more than any other HUD rule, which is amazing, and it's all thanks to you, but we can definitely get more. So before we wrap up for today, I'm just going to see if we have any outstanding questions. Nope. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining, and please go now, keepfamiliestogether.org, submit your comments, post your photos. Let's do this. Thanks everyone.